And we can begin. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Woodburn Accountants and Advisors China webinar series on what you need to know about accounting and tax in China. You have joined us for part 2 or day 2 in this webinar series where we will be looking at the ins and outs of corporate banking in China. Yesterday, we reflected on how to create your China budget and the importance of creating a budget for the Chinese market. And later on in the week, we will be looking at the Chinese tax system, the VAT Fapiao invoicing system, looking at how fraud can occur, particularly with things like Luckin Coffee. And we'll be looking at specifically at fraud on expenses, as well as what can lead to a tax audit. And our last day, we'll be looking at the profit repatriation strategies that can be created and designed in order to get money out of China. We will also be looking in depth at the actual outbound payment processes that exist in China, looking at the full payment process from what you need to know at the tax bureau, what you need to know at the bank. And I also have a guest speaker that will be joining on Thursday in relation to how individuals that are residing in China, how they can get their capital out. So let's get started and begin with today's session regarding the ins and outs of corporate banking in China. Now, to begin today's session, and it's the same slide on every presentation, so apologies for those that have seen this many times. Who is this webinar for? Well, today's webinar specifically will be more directed to the newbies in China that don't have an entity yet, but they're looking at opportunities that exist in China and they want to learn more about how China works, what the systems are like. Today's presentation specifically on the ins and outs of corporate banking is more around how to choose the right banking partner for your business and looking at tips in relation to the operational side of the banking world. Obviously, if you're a startup or you're an experienced China hand and you already have an entity in China, then I assume you will already have your bank accounts in place, but perhaps they're not working as efficiently as you would like them to. So in this presentation, I'll give you a bit of a guide on how you can possibly change your bank and also what tips to think about from an operational perspective. So how the webinar works is that I try to teach as much as I can and educate you in relation to the ins. If you do have any questions at all about the corporate banking world and how things work from a company's perspective, please do insert those into the questions section of the control panel, okay? This will be about 60 minutes of your time spent. Use it, really use it to your value, okay? I will be staying on until all the questions are answered. A little bit of a disclaimer, because I do know, and it happened even yesterday, there are some technical issues going on with GoToWebinar. It really does depend on your bandwidth. It depends on where you are based. If you are in countries like China or the Middle East, you may have to utilize a VPN to have a better connection. If you're simply having a bad technical day, just remember we are recording this webinar. It's going to be going up on our YouTube channel, and you will get a link to the recording. So if you get kicked off at any point and you're getting frustrated, know that you can look at the recording later on. And a copy of the presentation will also be provided to you. So who am I? My name is Christina Kohler-Coluccia. I'm the head of business advisory at Woodburn Accountants and Advisors. I have 16 years, almost 17 years of experience in the corporate services and compliance sector in China specifically. I've been based in Shanghai since 2003. I've been working with over 500 international companies with their market entry into China, looking at their pre-investment plans, validating business plans and budgets, and helping to implement the structures that they would like to create, helping them to grow and accelerate in the market through different phases of their implementation. And I'm also a creator of the China Roadmap program, and I'll touch on one slide on that a little bit later on in today's presentation. Just very briefly, I know China is basically getting out of COVID-19, but there's still a lot of countries around the world that are in the midst of this crisis. During that period, I did write an ebook about insights that I've learned during COVID-19 in relation to the China business, whether there's a personal reflection in the book as well, and looking at the various opportunities that have come out for foreign investors. So if that is something you're interested to read on, just email me, Christina@woodburnglobal.com, and I'd be happy to give you a complimentary copy on that. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm a creator of the China Roadmap program. So after 16 years of being in the Chinese market and helping over 500 companies with their strategies into China, I sort of created this roadmap where I can actually place almost every single client into this roadmap. This roadmap should be a guide to all companies or entrepreneurs that are looking to go into the Chinese market and need basically a bullet point checklist to know what they have to create and do to protect themselves, to protect their business. So very briefly, there are 3 milestones in this China roadmap. The first one is opportunity, evaluating those opportunities. You need to gain 3 different superpowers to optimize that opportunity and understand if there's going to be a return on investment. The second milestone is the actual implementation, not necessarily implementing a company. It's implementing an ecosystem, a suit of armor, and operational guidelines on how you should be creating your business in China. So that can be for companies that are simply transacting and the transactions are increasing, or companies that are actually implementing a structure in the Chinese market. And the last point is growth. Again, for anyone, because obviously if you're doing business in China, what you want to ultimately achieve is growth, and hopefully in an accelerated format. So obviously, from my perspective, to really be able to make decisions and keep the focus on growing, you've got to be able to read and understand your financial management reports, and part of that is also your bank statements. You've got to be able to analyze these details so that you can make focused decisions on how to move your company in the right direction. So that's all about the China Roadmap program. And obviously to this week's webinar series, which is really focused on the accounting and tax system, it's all about creating system processes, operational guidelines, but it also is helping you to focus on growth, being able to give you tips and guidance on how to read your numbers, how to analyze those numbers, and how to protect yourself overall. So what are we covering today? Today we're going to be looking at how to choose your banking partner, some questions you should be asking yourself when choosing your banking partner. How does the local banking structure look like? What are the types of accounts you're going to be setting up? What are the differences between those accounts? What payment options exist? Also looking at foreign exchange controls. And then lastly, in the conclusion, I will be asking you a lot of questions about what is important from an operational perspective to actually run and manage these accounts. So first of all, let's think about choosing your banking partner in China. So ultimately, you have 2 choices. One is to go with an international bank that is established, or alternatively, going with a Chinese bank that's established. And this is a bit of the first dilemma that exists, because let's face it, if you are a foreign investor, your comfort level is probably going to be higher going with an international bank than with a Chinese bank. After 16 years of being in China and having had a pretty bad experience with an international bank, I can safely say I feel more confident working with a Chinese bank than with an international bank. And I'll explain a little bit on the experience that I personally had a little bit later. So here are sort of the decisions that you have to make in the forefront. And this is part of the pre-investment stage, right? So when you are creating your entity, you also have to think about the back end of that, the operational side. Who is going to operate what, and what type of transactions are going to be running through the company? You have to be very, very clear about this. So the first thing you've got to do is understand the nature of your business transactions. And what that basically means is, are you purely doing local domestic transactions, or will there be a considerable portion of your business that is overseas transactions? Okay, so you have those two options really. And then the third option is where you're going to have a mix and match of both domestic transactions as well as some overseas transactions. If your business is primarily focused on the Chinese domestic market, meaning that in the trading business you are buying buying goods locally and selling goods locally, or if you're in the production side where you are buying raw materials locally and you are selling locally, my suggestion would be to stick with a local bank. There's no point working with an international bank. The international bank should actually only be triggered if you're planning on having a large volume of overseas international remittances, okay? Now, why do I say that? And I'll touch again on this, so there'll be a lot of repetition, but I want things to be clear for you and transparent for you. If you're going to be working with local suppliers and local customers, or and that those customers can be individuals or they can be corporates, then most likely they are going to be also using local banks. So it's only safe to say that when you're thinking about having smooth banking transactions, Chinese bank to Chinese bank, or even within the same bank, it's going to be a lot easier than if there's an international bank that comes into play, okay? Why do I say this? Because the international banks are not local banks, and as a consequence to that, they have more stringent requirements and criteria that they themselves have to fulfill, making your life more difficult when transacting, because it just means more paperwork that has to fall on your desk, okay? So think very carefully about your business transactions, and think very, very carefully about, first of all, does it make more sense to go with a Chinese bank? Does it make more sense to go with an international bank? If your entity in China is purely a cost center, then my suggestion would be to try and work with the same bank that you're working with from abroad, because it's going to be interbank transactions, basically. Money coming from abroad into your local bank account, and you're spending that money, and there's only one overseas transfer. So to make sure that it's within the same bank, again, facilitates it much, much easier. Again, international banks are obviously much better to work with if a good portion of your business is international, meaning that there are more overseas transactions, whether it's inbound into China or outbound coming out of China, than going with a local bank. Particularly if there are sister related companies, to work again within the same banking entity. Again, makes it a lot easier. Excuse me. If you are looking for investments, so this is obviously something that I get asked that quite a lot now, where companies are looking to either obtain loans from banks in China, or they're looking for Chinese investors. It will help to work with a well-established Chinese bank, either to get a significant loan, or because your individual investors are based in mainland China. There'll be much less paperwork involved, and the procedure will be actually smoother than going with an international bank. And then the last option, which is what I'm actually recommending to most of my clients at the moment, especially if in their startup phase they are going to be quite small, is to work with a smaller bank where you are bound to get a relationship manager. Obviously, getting a relationship manager facilitates everything for you, because you have a point of contact immediately that you can approach with any questions at all. The relationship manager component should not be underestimated. And obviously, if you work with an international bank, or if you work with a very large Chinese bank, Bank of China, for example, you most likely will not get a relationship manager, which means your relationship manager is going to be the teller or the person behind the desk at the bank branch that you are banking with, okay? So look at that as an advantage. Well, you need to basically, for me, it's a huge advantage, but for you, you need to analyze, do we need a relationship manager? Is it a necessity? Now, I say it's a necessity if you do not have yet senior managers on the ground in China. If you don't have senior management, but you have actually just operational people, salespeople, back-end people, engineers, etc., that are in China, they're not going to know how to do the administrative functions. And don't act like they can learn it. They will never be able to learn it. That's not their background, okay? So if you don't have a general manager sitting on the ground, or if you don't have, again, senior management roles appointed in China, then think about a smaller bank so that you, in your head office, you have a point of contact at the bank that you can communicate with, all right? And you're not reliant on someone on the ground doing it for you. I also say this if you're outsourcing your accounting. So initially, and I'll use us as an example, I'm not trying to sell anything here, but I'm using it as an example. We can act as the contact with the bank. But what I tell my clients is at the incorporation stage, don't rely on my relationship or my team's relationship with the bank. Because if at some point you decide to terminate our services for whatever reason, you will have to get in touch with the bank and be the person who gets in touch with the relationship manager. So it better be a bank that you like, that you know the people, that you can communicate well with. Okay, don't rely on the third parties to establish those relationships and maintain them. It does not make sense. The next is really in relation to operations. So in red, I've written, try to choose a bank close to your company, but recognize that the closest banks may not always be the most convenient, okay? Now I say choose a bank that is close to your company because although every single bank has an online banking service, an online banking platform, the online banking platform is purely for domestic transactions. If you want to conduct any overseas transfers, so outbound, or you want to confirm the receipt of any overseas transfers inbound, so let me rephrase that. I feel like I might have confused you because I've confused myself. If you're doing any overseas transfers, money coming in, money going out, those applications, those transfers have to be done in person at the bank. Which means if your company is heavy on international transactions, you don't want to be a 10-kilometer drive away from the bank, okay? Whoever is responsible to go to the bank is going to be spending, at least in Shanghai, is going to be spending a numerous amount of time either in the metro or on a taxi or driving because of the traffic, okay? So you want to choose something that's walking distance that can help and facilitate doing these cross-border transfers and getting the approvals done, etc. Okay, so the downside to this is if you are in a CBD area, most likely the bank branches in that CBD area are going to be constantly packed. So I'll give you an example. If you know Shanghai and you know Jing'an district, you've got Plaza 66. And that area, you've got a Bank of China branch, you've got an HSBC branch, and there are a couple of other branches around the area. Usually from 10 a.m. all the way to about 4 p.m., they are crowded. And so instead of driving, you're spending time getting a ticket and waiting for your number to be shown, and again, spending, close to 60, 70 minutes waiting. So, evaluate, don't underestimate that component because that's a lot of time wastage and inefficiency. Choose the right bank branch and location, also based on where you're going to be, okay? To avoid any complications, and again, this is for companies that are being smart about their decision. and realize that they need to have a relationship, a point of contact, or they need to have a certain level of control to be able to access a point of contact at the bank. Obviously, go with a bank or a bank branch that has somebody who at a minimum speaks English and can communicate with you. Ultimately, you can do that test also over the phone when you're in the stage of understanding with which branch you want to work with. So be aware of that component, that you need to be able to gain access to them. You don't want to feel hesitant because of any language barrier. So do your tests and have those conversations before choosing the bank. All right. And again, think about having that relationship manager. So does the bank offer a relationship manager? Who is it going to be? Can you meet them before actually opening the accounts? For me, those are really critical issues. What is the tendency for foreign investors? Well, the main tendency is obviously that they go with the foreign banks. But here's the issue. With most of the foreign international banks, quite frankly, the issue is that you don't choose, they choose you. So if you want to work with a bank like HSBC, Standard Chartered, Hang Seng Bank, Citibank, any of these banks, Royal Bank of Scotland, even these types of banks, it is not so much you choosing them, it's more the bank choosing you as a client. And some banks will have certain requirements that they will only take companies that have certain registered capital levels. They will only take clients where there is a relationship in the head office. They will only take clients that have an estimated upcoming revenue of XYZ. So if you are wanting to go with an international bank, make sure you know what their criteria is to maintain you as a client, and that they're actually interested in having your business. But in that pre-investment stage, make sure you also raise the question, what happens if we don't reach these levels? Will you kick us out? What is the procedure of kicking us out? And why do I say that? Because I was kicked out. HSBC, after 15 years of doing business with them in Shanghai, they terminated our service. And I had 30 days to change banks, sorry. And initially, I actually thought that the email I had received was a prank and a spam email, so I didn't even really focus on it until I got a second warning 2 weeks later, which meant I had 15 days to find a new bank. So when you're working with these the local banks will never kick you out. When you're working with these international banks, make sure that you know what their policies are. Ask these questions. And again, I know I'm biased because I've had a bad experience, and I apologize for that. Maybe some of you have had wonderful experiences, but be aware of this issue, all right? So make sure you have that in the back of your mind. Now, the advantages for me of working with a local bank are predominantly, one, the application procedure. And it might be silly saying the application procedure because that's just a one-off thing, but most people that incorporate in China wish they were incorporated yesterday. So they're in a rush for everything. So the bank account process in China now is quite lengthy compared to what it was before. It is a 1-month process in itself just to do the bank account opening. And that's also with a local bank. More time will be required for a foreign and international bank. So calculate 25 to 30 working days to open the accounts until physical remittance can be made into the account. Obviously, there are substantially more Chinese commercial banks than foreign bank branches. So if you're thinking of working with ICBC, Merchants Bank, Agricultural Bank of China, Bank of China, et cetera, you will find bank branches everywhere, okay? Foreign bank branches are not as many. So again, think about where your office is going to be located, who is in, let's say, a 1 kilometer radius, and then evaluate if there are any foreign banks, and does it then make sense from an efficiency perspective to work with the foreign bank, all right? Most Chinese companies have local bank accounts. So it's basically doing interbank transfers, which facilitates and makes everything much faster, much smoother. And generally speaking, from a security perspective, the Chinese banks offer greater security as well. Again, because the foreign banks are a little bit limited on that, as they are the foreign competitors to the Chinese banks. So keep that in mind as well. Tips on choosing a bank. Now, I know that currently, if you are in the phase of choosing a bank, or if you're in a phase of wanting to switch banks, this is what I will say to you. In order to make a solid decision, go and sit down with your banker. You will not be able to make any decision through what I'm saying today. You need to actually physically go to the bank branches, make comparisons, sit down with the bankers, and then basically create a list of pros and cons working with each bank. Okay, and at the end of this presentation, I'll be giving you questions to ask. Okay, but you've got to sit down with the bankers to know exactly if they're going to be able to fulfill what you want them to fulfill. You've got to have this open dialogue and this open communication. If you don't have that, you're not going to know if they're suitable for you or not. Now, I am fully aware that right now, nobody can travel into China. I completely understand this. However, it does not prevent you from doing phone calls, which are also a useful test to understand if they are fluent in English or not. Okay? If you cannot communicate over the phone, you won't be able to communicate face-to-face either. So make sure that you do these meetings so that you understand what is, the operational side of things when working with each of these banks. Okay. I will say that generally speaking, even with the foreign banks, you will get good levels of service. Okay. Banks are restricted in China. It's not their fault. They have certain requirements that they have to fulfill. And very, very strict compliance procedures too, just like anywhere else in the world. So although, you may think that the service level is not great, it is probably the best you're going to get. The issue is just from an operational perspective, are they fulfilling your needs, or do you need to switch banks? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the banking structure to give you an overview of how decisions are made is what I want to say. How decisions are made, how things flow in the hierarchy level of banks. So at the top of the hierarchy, you've got one central bank, which is the People's Bank of China. And the People's Bank of China approves your account. Okay, this is also why the application procedure is quite lengthy. You then have three policy banks. These are the banks that create the banking policies. And you've got the China Development Bank, Export-Import Bank of China, and the Agricultural Development Bank of China. Then you've got the big five, which is Bank of China, ICBC, Bank of Communications, China Construction Bank, Agricultural Bank of China. And then you've got 12 joint stock commercial banks, you've got the city commercial banks, you've got the rural commercial banks, and then you've got the foreign banks. So you can already see in this hierarchy that the foreign banks are actually at the bottom. All right. So keep that also in your mind in terms of the approval processes that they have to go through and the compliance procedures that they have to go through. All right. In terms of renminbi account types, there are various types of accounts that a Chinese company has to have. The first one is the renminbi basic account. This is mandatory. The important thing to remember about the renminbi basic account is that you can only have one of those, which means if you have set up currently a renminbi basic account, that account cannot be changed. You cannot close it down. You cannot move that account anywhere else. The general account is part of the renminbi basic account, except it's the foreign currency accounts and the transactional account. So the general account is what I call, actually in operational terms, the settlement accounts, where you're physically doing your transactions through. All renminbi transactions go into the renminbi basic account. The renminbi basic account is also the account where you can only withdraw cash. The general account is basically where international transfers go in and out of. So you'll have, for example, a euro account, USD account, Hong Kong dollar account, pounds account, as you wish. Then you have specialized accounts, and there's a bunch of different types of these. You won't have that account specifically when you incorporate your entity, but they are, for example, escrow accounts or temporary expense accounts, things like that can pop up when, for example, you want to set up branch offices or things like that you may need these types of accounts. And then finally, you've got the capital contribution account, which ultimately is where if you have a registered capital amount, that money is going to flow into the capital contribution account. All right. So ultimately, you are going to set up 3 accounts: the capital contribution account, the renminbi basic, and the general account. Now let's talk about what each of these accounts means. So first of all, you've got the capital contribution account, and its associated transactions are those that are based on the registered capital base of the company. Okay. Ultimately, the registered capital flows into that account. It could very well be that once all the registered capital is submitted and utilized, you will never use that account again. However, for those companies that have been established prior to the new foreign investment law, it is also where your foreign debt, those emergency funds that I was talking about yesterday, where that will also go into the capital account. If you are getting loans, it will also go into the capital account. Now, the capital account is not as easy as everybody imagines it to be. Where probably in your mind, you're thinking, okay, I remit the registered capital, let's say, I don't know, 100,000 US dollars into the capital account. It gets converted and gets transferred into the settlement accounts, either the renminbi basic or something else. Wrong. So when you start up your company for a period of 6 months to 1 year, once the capital arrives in the capital account, it's going to be registered, which is an application in itself. And then any time that you want to pay off expenses, you need to bring the supporting documentation, and it will be actually remitted from the capital account. All right. It'll be directly converted into renminbi at that point, and then remitted directly from that account. It won't go into the settlement account yet. Again, a question you should be asking the bank is, at what point will we be able to stop doing these types of expense payments through the capital account, and when will that be transferred over to the settlement accounts? This is number one question you should be asking, because it will help a lot with the efficiency aspect of things. So please do keep that in mind in relation to the capital contribution accounts. So for example, salaries, you need to bring employment contracts, you need to bring salary payroll breakdowns, provide that to the bank as supporting documentation, and then the transfers can be made. That has to happen at the bank. Not possible to do it online, okay? As soon as the money is in the settlement accounts, that you can then do online. That's phase 2 of the bank account operation. Same with rent. If you need to pay rental amounts, you take the rental contract, you take the invoice from the landlord, you bring that to the bank, they will read it, and I trust me, they read these things, okay? If things don't match between the invoice and the contract, you will have to go back to your landlord to make sure that everything matches, okay? Which means amendments will have to be made. And then you bring it back to the bank in order to make sure that the rental amounts can be paid from that account. Again, the question of how long you have to spend on that procedure really depends on the bank, depends on your operation, and depends on open communication with your relationship manager. Now looking at the renminbi basic and the general accounts, okay? And these are all related to the actual transactions of your business, whether it's the import, export of goods, the sale of domestic purchase or sale of domestic products, as well as the delivery of services, okay? So it's purely trade transactions. If all of this is in relation to renminbi transactions, you're going to be using the renminbi basic account. You will use the general account or the settlement accounts for the foreign currency transactions. What you should also note is that from these accounts, dividend repatriation will be made, and these will ultimately become your daily accounts, okay? Once all the registered capital is used up, these are the accounts that you'll be focusing on. Renminbi Basic, this again is where you can do everything online. General accounts, when you're talking about international transfers, everything has to be done face-to-face at the bank. Now, what type of payment options are there? So first of all, you've got online banking. Again, every single bank has an online platform. They provide 2 key tokens, which should in theory be provided to 2 individuals, one of whom is a cashier who inputs the data to make transfers or approve transfers. And then you have the authorizer who has the 2nd key token to authorize any outgoing payments that have to be made. Then you've got obviously the branch banking, which can be done at each of the branches. And then you also have direct connectivity, which is anything from Alipay, WeChat Pay, any of these other payment platforms that can be utilized. Cross-border payment considerations. Now, I will actually be going in much greater detail about how this physically works in on Thursday's presentation. But basically, cross-border payments, you need to provide supporting documentation to the banks to authenticate the payments. So for an example, when I invoice a client for an incorporation in China, I have to invoice their overseas entity because they don't have an entity yet in China. In order to actually release the payment once it has arrived, I have to provide a original service agreement where all signatures and chops are original, not scanned copies, and invoice. Again, with chops and all of this placed on it. It is tedious. Quite frankly, it's a pain. But it's something that you have to do in order to release those payments, okay? So you'll get a notification once it arrives. In order to physically release it and then use that money, you have to bring the supporting documentation inside. And it's like this for any of these international types of transactions, even for dividend transactions, which we'll be talking about on Thursday, you'll have to provide the supporting documentation. So foreign exchange controls, basically, everything that you have to do physically at the bank is because of the foreign exchange controls, okay? Approvals have to be made by the People's Bank of China as well as the State Administration of Foreign Exchange. Now, nowadays, there are thresholds where you don't have to go through approval processes at the state, at the SAFE, the State Administration of Foreign Exchange, or at the PBOC. But in many instances, you will still have to add that as a approval level when releasing funds or when trying to get funds out of China. Now, here are a couple of tidbits on the issues that the banks have to go through. So you've got to have a little bit of sympathy with the banks because they have a lot of reporting to do to the PBOC as well as to the SAFE, okay? So first of all the banks have to report domestic and overseas cash transactions of more than 50,000 renminbi. Previously, it used to be 200,000 renminbi. Now it's 50,000 renminbi. That's not a lot, okay? But they have to report each of those, which is why you have to give all of that supporting documentation. Banks also need to report any overseas transfers by individuals of more than 10,000 USD. And they also have to report every single foreign exchange transaction of at least 5 million USD. And then if you are a mainland Chinese company and you're looking to invest abroad, then you also have to go through approval processes as well in order to get green lighted to remit funds over. So It's not easy for the banks either. It's extremely bureaucratic. And on Thursday, you'll obviously see then the document lists that are associated with each of these individual transfers that have to be made abroad. So let's go through the conclusion of today and what you need to know. So the number one point that I want to highlight and that I mentioned earlier is that you've got to be able to achieve open communication with your bank, okay? You need to be able to communicate, whether it's by email, by WeChat, by phone, okay? So to make a decision on how to choose your bank, meet with the various banks, compare service level, and start the communication. If there is a bank you're not comfortable with, or you just don't feel like there's a communication level there that can be maintained, that's not the right bank for you, okay? But compare it, all right? Make sure you have the ability to do a comparison. Now, when you're going through the application procedure, the bank will want to ask you certain questions about, what is about your future plans within the entity. So for example, I know that HSBC, because I've recently just opened an account there for a client, they want to know what is the estimated revenue level for year 1 and year 2 of operation. So, you've got to be open with them. You've got to explain everything you're doing, planning on doing, and what you need from them, okay? That has to be an open dialogue. And when they're asking questions about your business, be truthful. Explain what is going to happen, okay? If you are not truthful and open with them, then potentially you might have a situation down the line, whether it's 6 months or 2 years down the line, where they can't fulfill a service for you because you didn't talk about it in the early stages, okay? During that meeting, you should also discuss how many accounts are going to be needed and what will be the functions of each account. It should be the bank that is informing you of all the accounts that are necessary and what those accounts will be used for and how can you actually use them operationally, okay? Then you have to know what services you will require from the bank. So one of the things I always recommend my clients is prior to going to the bank, again, on a piece of paper, make bullet points. What do you need from the bank? Okay, you need to pay expenses. You need to be able to receive funds from overseas, both as capital as well as just client transfers. You will need to be able to make payments overseas because you'll have certain costs overseas as well. Will you be adding investors over time? And can the bank then handle those new investors that will be coming in? Will you be asking the bank for a loan, or will you be obtaining a loan in another format from an individual or another bank or another agency? You've got to know yourself what you need from the bank, okay? And try and think, obviously, what you need in the short term, and then obviously what you need in the long term as well. Then you need to know what documents are needed for opening the account, okay? And again, if you're making a comparison between international banks and local Chinese banks, ask this question. What is the length of time for opening the bank account? What documents will be needed for opening the bank account? What documents will be needed for operating the account later on? For example, if you're going to have domestic service transactions or trade transactions, I mentioned earlier that to release the funds from the capital account for rent, you have to show lease agreement and an invoice. Verify these simple things with the bank in terms of what is needed. The next point is actually really the most critical. When you're going through the application phase, the original passport of the appointed legal representative will need to be shown. You will need to ask the bank, do they have to see the individual in person, or can just the passport be couriered for authentication? Or can the passport be authorized at a Chinese consulate in your home jurisdiction? Will that suffice for the bank account opening? Obviously, with COVID-19, you need to discuss these options because Anybody who's appointed as a legal rep who is not based in China cannot fly there. And you don't want this to be a hurdle, okay? So discuss with the bank what options they are offering. Thus far, I just did this with Bank of Shanghai. They needed to get the new passport of the legal rep. Obviously, the legal rep couldn't fly, so they couriered the passport to us, and we then provided and hand delivered it to the bank for authentication. So there's a lot of different ways that you can organize all of this, but you need to have that clear and transparent communication. What you also need to verify is there a Chinese and English online banking system, and are the two languages synchronized with each other? So, for example, I bank with ICBC. My head of finance in Shanghai always uses the Chinese version. I go on and always use the English version. It is synchronized, and it just facilitates quite easily. So with whichever bank you're working with, make sure that you have this option of Chinese and English. Again, make sure it's important to you. Having an English version has always been important for me. Is it important for you? And if it is important, make sure that they obviously have it and that it's synchronized so that it's not double entry functions. Oh, sorry, and one additional thing about the online banking system is if you are having meetings with your bank virtually, you know, on Zoom or whatever platform it might be, ask them to give you a demo of the online banking system so that at least you can see through the demo whether it's complicated or not. All right, to log in, first of all, to download the software, to log in, and to operate it. Okay, make sure you ask for that demo. The next is, and again, this is all about the operation side of things. So for me, it is really critical that I don't have to go online to see whether payments have been received or payments have been made, I know because I do them myself, but whether payments have been received. I don't have time to go every day. What I would like to have is either an email notification, an SMS notification, or a WeChat notification. So ask your bank, do they offer this? And in some banks, so I have some clients that get email notifications and I have some banks that get SMS notifications. Make sure you get notifications because this will help with the whole efficiency of your operation, and make sure you know who's getting these notifications. Just so you know, by SMS, it has to be a Chinese mobile number. Otherwise, you don't get them. The next one is bank signatories. So in China, one item that has to be part of a bank signatory is the financial CHOP. When you're doing anything physically at the bank, the financial CHOP has to be on the documents. Sometimes you will have the legal rep CHOP that's also required and the company CHOP that's also required. But ultimately, who has the power of attorney to authorize payments? Now, again, this is an operational aspect. So when you're doing online banking, as I mentioned earlier, there are two key tokens. Who is physically going to have those two key tokens? Who's going to input the data? Has to be input in Chinese characters. And who's going to authorize it? Okay, so that's for online banking. Then when you've got international transfers, what is going to be utilized to initiate either the release of payment into your account or the release of payment out of your account? One has to be the finance CHOP. So then again, from an operational perspective, who is going to hold that CHOP? And then the second point is, are you going to have physical signatures or are you going to utilize the legal rep CHOP? Now, I'll use us as an example because we've bulletproofed it. We have two people that are acting as bank signatories with actual signatures, as well as the legal rep CHOP, which means we have three options plus the finance CHOP. And this has given us much greater flexibility in case something happens to a senior manager, whether, physically, accidental wise, or death, or whatever it might be, but also in terms of travel. Most senior managers are not going to be sitting at their desks every single day. They're going to be traveling in and out of China, and you've got to make sure that your bank is continuously operating, okay? So you've got to understand what is going to make the process the most efficient to operate the account so that there is no bottleneck that is occurring, okay? Then in relation to outbound payments, whether it's service fees, trade transactions, dividends, you've got to consult with the bank about what is the document list and payment flow. Now, this is where I get very frustrated with ICBC because we don't do trade. Obviously, we're a management consulting firm. I only have service fees, and if I'm paying anything, it is also in relation to third-party service fees. And I can tell you my frustration lies because the document list is never the same. So basically what we need to do is we always need to verify prior to initiating anything, i.e. going to the bank, that we're signing off on the right documents. It's a pain, it's annoying, but that is ultimately the bureaucracy in relation to outbound payments. And I know why it stems from that. It stems from that because at ICBC, we don't get a relationship manager. And so you call the guy at the bank and you say, okay, last time I needed XYZ. Could you please verify for me again this time what I need? And he'll say, well, sorry, this time you need ABC. And it's because we don't have a relationship manager where we're continuously talking to the same person who's giving us the details. We're always talking to different people that are going to be at the bank at that time. So it makes it complicated, it makes it inefficient, it makes it extremely tiring and frustrating, which for me is a downside of working with one of the big fives, okay? I would have preferred working with a smaller bank. It just at that time didn't come to my mind to investigate it because at that time I was in a time crunch. And this is also something, that's a big mistake for most companies is they're in a time crunch, so they don't investigate properly. And that happened to us. So I don't recommend it. This is why I'm trying to emphasize as much as possible. Go out there, talk to as many different banks as possible, make a pros and cons list of each bank so you understand who you really would like to work with. And most importantly, think about the operational side of things, right? So, here's outbound payments. I haven't included a bullet point about inbound payments. So if inbound payments come into your account from overseas, what documents do you have to provide and what's the process to release those funds? That's another question you should be asking yourself. All righty. So this is the only page I'm going to sell you something. Apologies for that, but how can we help you? Again, we help clients go on a China roadmap program, things like bank accounts and considerations for that. We act as a sounding board for your operation. So if you want to brainstorm or you just want somebody to listen to you and give you advice, don't hesitate to reach out. It's part of this China roadmap program that we put our clients on. We can help with incorporation advisory, business plan, budget validation. We also do the actual incorporations, and we also help with implementation and growth services. If you want to have more information about what we do, you can very easily set up a meeting with me. Again, no strings attached to these meetings. It's just a way for you to build up your ecosystem, get to know each other. I feel like networking is so vital in China. So if it is something of interest, I put the link in the chat box. You can set up a meeting directly in my diary, and I'd be happy to talk to you regarding your stages right now. So I'm going to open the floor now for questions. Nothing has come in so far. I'm going to give you guys about 30 seconds to 1 minute. If you want to type something in, if you've got a question, I would be very happy to answer it. I hate it when there's a bit of silence, so I'm going to chit chat for a bit. Maybe some of you are typing. No, nothing coming in. I'm just going to move on because I know some people will want to get out of here. But if you do have questions, you can still type it in. And if it pops up at the end of the slides, then I'll take a look at it. So like I said, you know, if you do want to have a meeting, please feel free to do that. I see the questions coming up. So from Amelia, is it easier to set up in the free trade area? It depends, Amelia. Free trade zones are only of value if you are physically trading. So if you are a service-oriented company, the free trade zone does nothing for you. Free trade zones are really of only value if you're doing import and export business, predominantly because there are benefits. If you import products from abroad, you don't have to pay customs duty immediately. You pay on consignment when you actually sell into the local areas of China. So there are some trade benefits in terms of customs, etc. Ultimately, in terms of profits tax, no change. It's unified all over China. That would be the only advantage. I mean, in Shanghai, for example, the free trade zone is now extended all the way to Pudong. So if you are a trading company and currently there are no benefits to you, I would still say go set up in the free trade zone because you're still in a CBD area of Pudong. If ultimately you really don't see any benefits, there's no point to actually set up there. Especially service companies, they don't have to be there at all. It really comes down to if you're a trading company. And in terms of the free trade areas in relation to banks, if you're setting up in Pudong, well, all the headquarters of banks are in the Pudong area anyhow. So you could actually utilize the head office as your banking branch if you wished. Oh, now the questions are coming. Fantastic. Robin, how easy is it to set up a WFOE and does it vary depending on the geography? Not really, Robin. Nowadays, quite frankly, the incorporation of a company is unified. Currently, since Jan 1, 2020, everybody is under the new foreign investment law. That's for foreign investors as well as for domestic investors. So it's a very fair playing field. In terms of geography, really there's no difference. There are slight differentiations in terms of the step-by-step procedures, but ultimately it's exactly the same. Timeframes will also be very, very similar. So, you know, when you're deciding to set up a company in China, do an analysis on location to make sure you're going in the right city for your business. Don't think about it in terms of compliance or administration aspects because it is pretty much unified everywhere. Amelia, Robin, I hope I answered your questions. If there is anything else that's going to come in, let me know. Just type it into the question section of the control panel. I have 2 more webinars that are up and coming. Tomorrow, we're going to be looking at the Chinese tax system, the VAT Fapiao invoicing system, how fraud can occur in terms of expenses, and also what can lead to tax audits in China. So if you want to sign up for that, you can go to woodburnglobal.com/events. And on Thursday, we will be talking about profit repatriation strategies and also about outbound banking processes and how those work. And again, we're going to have a guest speaker, Howard Whiteson, who's going to be talking about how individuals can repatriate outside of China as well. So again, go to our website, woodburnglobal.com/events, if you would like to register. Thank you all very much for coming in. There are no more questions that popped up. So again, if you do have questions, you know, you can set up a meeting or just email me. I'm going to add my WeChat ID in here. You can add me on WeChat if you'd like to discuss, or just send me an email. I'm going to type that in as well to Christina@woodburnglobal.com. Thank you all for showing up. I hope you learned a little bit about what's happening with the corporate banking world in China. And if there's anything I can do for you, do let me know. Look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Have a great afternoon, great evening. Goodbye.